Jessica and Sophie had come to the isolated cabin seeking peace, but when the fog rolled in, it brought with it something far darker than either could have imagined. The chilling silence of the forest quickly turned into an unnerving presence, and before they knew it, they were not just trapped by the mist. They were being hunted. It all began on a crisp, sunlit morning in early spring, when Jessica decided it was time for a break. For months, she had been overwhelmed by the responsibilities of work and motherhood, and the constant hum of daily life had worn her thin. She knew Sophie, her energetic 8-year-old daughter, needed a getaway just as much as she did. So, after weeks of planning, Jessica had booked a week-long trip to a secluded cabin in Hollow Pines, a small town nestled deep in the woods, far from the chaos of the city. It seemed like the perfect escape, the kind of place where they could slow down, breathe, and reconnect. Sophie was ecstatic. The thought of exploring the woods, hiking through trails, and stargazing at night filled her with a kind of joy only children possess. She was a curious soul, always asking questions and eager to discover the world around her. Jessica, too, was looking forward to the simplicity of it all. No emails, no meetings, just her and Sophie surrounded by nature. It was the perfect opportunity to bond, to escape the noise that seemed to follow them wherever they went. They packed their bags with excitement. Jessica made sure to include everything they would need: hiking boots, snacks, books, and even a camera to capture the moments. Sophie insisted on bringing her favorite stuffed animal, Mr. Snuggles, and a sketchbook to document all the beautiful things she would see. It was a 2-day drive to Hollow Pines, and Jessica had carefully mapped out their route, planning stops at quaint diners along the way. Sophie, of course, had already made a list of all the roadside attractions they might encounter, particularly interested in any dinosaur-themed museums or quirky signs they could photograph. The drive was uneventful at first, filled with laughter and the sound of Sophie's constant chatter. They stopped to stretch their legs and take in the scenery. The landscape changed as they moved further away from the city, the urban sprawl giving way to wide-open fields and lush forests. As they neared Hollow Pines, however, something strange began to happen. The weather, which had been clear and warm, suddenly shifted. A thick fog began to roll in, swallowing the road ahead of them in a dense white mist. Jessica's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The fog was unlike anything she had ever seen before. It felt unnaturally heavy, as if it was pressing down on them from above. She tried to stay calm, but a sense of unease crept into her thoughts. Sophie, who had been so excited about the trip, grew quiet, her wide eyes watching the fog swirl outside the window. By the time they arrived in Hollow Pines, it was late afternoon. The fog had become even thicker, casting an eerie, almost dreamlike atmosphere over the town. The little cabin they were renting sat at the edge of a forest, secluded from the rest of the town. It looked picturesque, a cozy, rustic building surrounded by towering trees. Jessica smiled, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had been gnawing at her since the fog rolled in. She reassured Sophie that it was just the weather playing tricks on them, but even she couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something was off. They unloaded the car and made their way inside, the creaky wooden door groaning as Jessica turned the key. The cabin smelled of pine and fresh wood, and the warmth inside was a welcome relief from the chill outside. It felt peaceful, inviting even, yet there was something about the silence that unsettled her. The cabin had an old-world charm, but it also felt forgotten. as though it had been waiting for them. She tried to push the thought away, reminding herself that this was a place of relaxation, a retreat from everything. As night fell, they sat down to a simple dinner of soup and sandwiches. Outside, the fog had thickened even more, obscuring everything. Beyond a few feet of the cabin's porch, Sophie's excitement had faded, replaced with a quiet curiosity as she peered out the window, scanning the darkness. Jessica noticed her daughter's unease, but attributed it to the unfamiliar surroundings. After all, it was a new place. Things were bound to feel strange at first. But as Jessica locked the door and turned off the lights for bed, a sense of foreboding lingered in the air, an unexplainable weight that wouldn't let go. Little did she know, their dream vacation was about to take a terrifying turn. The morning after their arrival, Jessica and Sophie woke up to a damp, foggy landscape outside the cabin window. The mist had not lifted overnight, and the world beyond the porch was veiled in a ghostly haze. Despite the weather, Jessica was determined to make the most of their trip. Sophie, always full of energy, was eager to begin their first hike. After a quick breakfast, they donned their boots and packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and a first aid kit, ready to explore the forest surrounding the cabin. The trail they had planned to follow was just beyond the cabin, a winding path that led through thick trees and down to a small creek. As they began their walk, the air was cool, and the fog clung to the ground like a thick carpet. The path, which should have been easy to follow, was becoming difficult to see. The fog made everything look blurry, the trees looming like shadows in the distance. Still, Sophie was thrilled by the adventure, skipping ahead and calling out to the birds she spotted in the trees. Jessica, however, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been following her since the night before. The woods were unnervingly quiet. No rustling animals, no chirping insects, just the soft sound of their footsteps on the damp earth. As they continued along the trail, the silence grew oppressive, and Jessica found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. The dense fog made it difficult to judge how far they had walked, and with each step, the world around them seemed to shrink. At times, the trees closed in so tightly that it felt as though they were walking through a tunnel of green. Sophie was oblivious to her mother's growing discomfort, laughing as she tossed a rock into a small stream they crossed. Jessica forced herself to smile and enjoy the moment, but the quiet tension remained. They reached a small clearing near the stream where Sophie wanted to rest. It was peaceful here, with the gentle sound of water trickling over rocks, but even in this serene spot, Jessica's nerves didn't settle. Her eyes kept darting to the trees surrounding them, scanning the area for any sign of movement. Sophie, oblivious to her mother's discomfort, happily skipped stones across the water, occasionally asking Jessica to join her. For a moment, the tranquil surroundings almost made Jessica forget about her unease, but it was brief. As the two prepared to head back, Jessica's gaze swept the area once more, and that's when she saw them, footprints in the mud. They were large, deep impressions in the earth, made by boots much heavier than her own or Sophie's. Jessica froze, her breath catching in her throat. The footprints didn't belong to any animal. She couldn't make sense of them. She knew they hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and the idea that someone else had walked here, especially in the middle of nowhere, was unsettling. Her heart began to race as she studied the tracks. They led off the path, deeper into the woods, but Jessica couldn't bring herself to follow them. There was something about the footprints that felt wrong. They were too deliberate, as if someone had been watching them. She quickly turned her attention back to Sophie, who was still distracted by the stream, throwing stones with a concentration that made Jessica's anxiety grow. "Let's head back, Sophie," Jessica called, trying to sound calm, but her voice was tight with concern. Sophie skipped over, her face flushed with excitement, oblivious to her mother's rising panic. They began retracing their steps, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The silence around them felt heavier now, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It wasn't until they neared the edge of the trail that Jessica caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching them. The figure was obscured by shadows, and before Jessica could process it fully, the figure disappeared into the thick mist. Her heart hammered in her chest, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. "Sophie," Jessica said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to go back to the cabin now." Sophie, still cheery and unaware of the growing tension, skipped ahead, oblivious to the change in her mother's demeanor. Jessica glanced over her shoulder one last time, but the figure was gone. Her mind raced, but she couldn't make sense of what she had seen. Was it just her imagination? Had the fog played tricks on her? But the unease stayed with her as they walked back to the cabin, each step seeming to take longer than the last. When they arrived back at the cabin, Jessica double-checked the locks on the door, something she would never have done under normal circumstances. But today, everything felt different. The sense of being watched wouldn't leave her, and though Sophie was excited to have made it back, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were holding secrets. Secrets that were far darker than they could ever have imagined. The next morning, the fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it seemed to have grown even denser, wrapping itself around the cabin like an invisible hand. Jessica had hoped that the strange feelings she'd been having would fade with the new day, but the sense of foreboding only seemed to grow stronger. Sophie, still eager to explore, insisted they go into town to pick up some supplies. Jessica, although uneasy, thought it would be a good idea to get out of the cabin for a while. Maybe a change of scenery would help clear her mind. They left the cabin with Sophie chattering away, excited to see what the small town of Hollow Pines had to offer. The drive to town was short, but the fog was so thick that it was almost impossible to see beyond the front of the car. Jessica kept her focus on the road, trying to ignore the knot tightening in her stomach. Sophie, ever the optimist, noticed little else, commenting on the strange shapes the fog created, laughing when she thought the mist looked like ghosts. The town, when they arrived, was eerily quiet. The buildings were quaint and old-fashioned, each one with its own charm, but there was no bustle of people going about their day. It was a ghost town in more ways than one. Jessica found the lack of activity unsettling. She grabbed the essentials, food, some extra blankets, and a few other necessities, and tried to keep the mood light for Sophie's sake. The stop felt rushed, and before long they were back in the car, heading back to the cabin. As they neared the edge of town, Jessica noticed a few things that she hadn't seen before: faded signs for businesses long closed, houses abandoned and left to decay. It struck her as odd that the town felt so forgotten. The fog seemed to cling to everything, blurring the edges of reality and making it hard to tell where the town ended and the forest began. By the time they returned to the cabin, the eerie fog had thickened even more. The air was damp and cool, and the forest beyond the cabin appeared to be nothing more than a vague shadow, the trees barely visible through the mist. They parked the car and headed inside, both feeling the weight of the silence around them. The cabin, once so inviting, now felt like a cage. Jessica felt trapped in this strange, oppressive atmosphere, but Sophie was still in high spirits, eager to make the most of the day. But as they stepped into the cabin, Jessica's unease returned, in full force. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar, a crack of space between the frame and the door itself. She was certain she had locked it before leaving. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and she immediately grabbed Sophie's hand, pulling her inside. There was no sign of forced entry, nothing that suggested anyone had broken in, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. "Stay close," Jessica whispered to Sophie, her voice tight with worry. Sophie nodded, sensing the tension in her mother's demeanor. They moved cautiously through the cabin, calling out, but there was no response. The silence that had once been peaceful now felt suffocating. Jessica checked the windows, but everything seemed normal. No signs of anyone outside. Still, the feeling that something was wrong lingered in the air, thick and palpable. After searching the entire cabin, they found nothing out of place, yet the sense of unease refused to leave. Jessica tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just nerves, maybe the result of the unsettling fog. But when they went to the kitchen to unpack the groceries, things took a darker turn. The moment Jessica opened the fridge, she froze. The vegetables they had bought earlier were now scattered on the floor, as if someone had rifled through the shelves. But she hadn't seen anyone when they returned. No one could have gotten in, yet there it was. Proof that something or someone had disturbed their space. Her heart began to race. "Mom?" Sophie asked, her voice small and uncertain. "What's wrong?" Jessica turned to her daughter, her mind racing for an explanation. She didn't know how to answer. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. She had locked the door, made sure everything was secure, and yet, somehow, their sanctuary felt violated. Jessica hurried to the front door, her hands trembling as she checked the lock again. It was secure. She then checked the windows, double-checking every corner, but it was all in vain. The fear that had been slowly building within her was now an all-consuming terror. They were trapped. Something was out there. The sense of being watched grew more intense as the fog outside thickened, pressing in closer against the windows. It was as though the entire world had shrunk to the size of the cabin. Jessica could feel her pulse quicken with each passing moment. She didn't know if it was her imagination or if something truly was out there, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. The peace they had come to find was gone, replaced by an overwhelming dread that neither of them could explain. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cabin, Jessica made a decision. They couldn't stay there anymore. She would pack up, get them back in the car, and leave. But when she reached the door to grab her keys, she froze. The door, which had been locked just moments before, was now wide open. And standing in the doorway, just beyond the mist, was a shadow. The sight of the open door sent a cold shiver through Jessica's spine. Her heart pounded as she slowly backed away from the doorway, pulling Sophie behind her. The fog outside had thickened to the point where it seemed to swallow everything. Beyond the threshold, leaving only the faintest outline of the trees in the distance. The figure in the doorway, if it was even a person, was barely discernible, standing just outside the range of the cabin's dim light. Jessica's mind raced. Had someone followed them back to the cabin? How could they have opened the door without a sound? No one had been in the area when they'd returned, and she hadn't seen anyone near the cabin when she checked the perimeter earlier. Yet here it was, this unsettling, unexplainable presence, standing just beyond the doorway. "Mum," Sophie whispered, clutching her hand tightly, her voice quivering with fear. "Who's out there?" "I don't know, sweetie," Jessica said, her voice strained as she tried to steady herself. She felt an overwhelming need to protect Sophie, to keep her safe from whatever was out there, but she also knew she couldn't let fear control her. She had to act. Jessica's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for anything that could help. The phone was on the kitchen counter, but the signal had been weak the entire time they'd been here. It was useless. She couldn't call for help. The only option left was to leave, to get out of the cabin and away from whatever or whoever was outside. But the fog was so dense and the car was still parked in the driveway just a few hundred feet away. The thought of running out there into the mist, unsure of what they might encounter, filled her with dread. But staying here, locked in the cabin, wasn't an option either. "Stay here, Sophie," Jessica whispered, pushing the fear from her voice as best she could. "I'll check outside." Sophie nodded, her face pale with worry, and as Jessica moved toward the door, every step felt like it was leading her into the unknown. She slowly crept toward the threshold, her hand on the doorknob, heart racing in her chest. She hesitated for a moment, then swung the door open with a swift motion, her breath caught in her throat. The mist rolled in immediately, thick and suffocating. The world beyond the door was a blank void, a world swallowed by fog. There was no sign of the figure anymore, no footsteps, no sound of movement. It was as if it had never been there at all. Jessica's eyes scanned the empty yard, the trees swaying slightly in the breeze, but nothing seemed out of place. There was no one around, no figure, no movement, just the silence of the fog. But Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She stepped outside, her feet sinking slightly into the soft earth. Each breath felt colder than the last, and the world around her seemed to close in even tighter. The sound of the trees rustling was the only thing that broke the silence, but even that seemed distant, muffled by the fog. She glanced back toward the cabin where Sophie stood in the doorway, her small figure barely visible in the haze. "Mom, come back." Sophie's voice was small but urgent, echoing through the mist. Jessica turned, but before she could answer, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A shadow, flickering just at the edge of the forest. It was quick, too quick, moving in a way that no human could. It darted between the trees, vanishing into the fog before Jessica could even get a clear look. She froze. Her body stiffened. Her breath caught in her throat. Without thinking, she bolted back to the cabin, her footsteps heavy in the wet earth as she rushed to the door. Sophie was still standing in the doorway, her wide eyes filled with fear. "Mom," Sophie whispered, looking over her shoulder into the thick fog. "What's out there?" Jessica didn't answer. She slammed the door shut behind them, locking it tightly. Her hands were shaking as she turned the deadbolt, her mind racing. She had seen something. She wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was out there watching them, following them. Sophie tugged at her sleeve, her voice breaking. "Mum, I'm scared." Jessica knelt down to her daughter's level, forcing a smile despite the terror creeping up her spine. "It's okay, Sophie," she said, though her voice trembled. "We're safe inside." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't safe. The fog outside was thicker than ever, and the strange feeling that something was watching them had become unbearable. They were trapped in this cabin, surrounded by an impenetrable wall of mist, with no way to escape, no way to call for help. Jessica tried to remain calm, but the fear was suffocating. The walls of the cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. She turned to the window, peering out into the fog, but saw nothing. The figure, if it had been real, was gone. But the feeling lingered, the feeling of eyes on them, unseen, waiting. The air itself seemed charged with an ominous energy, as if the world outside was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The fog was no longer just a weather pattern. It was a barrier, a force that kept them isolated, cut off from the world. And in that isolation, Jessica realized with a sinking feeling that whatever was out there wasn't just watching them, it was hunting them. The hours dragged on, and the night stretched longer than Jessica had ever known. She sat in the corner of the cabin, her eyes darting between the window and the locked door, each creak of the wood, each distant rustle in the trees, sending waves of dread through her body. Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch, her breathing soft and steady. But Jessica couldn't find a moment of rest. The silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the occasional groan of the wooden walls as the wind pushed against them. The fog outside had not lifted, but now it seemed even more unnatural. It wasn't just the thickness that unsettled her, but the way it clung to everything, the way it seemed to wrap around the trees like tendrils of smoke. Something about it felt wrong, almost as if it had a life of its own. She could feel it, that heavy presence, pressing in from all sides, suffocating the world outside. Jessica's mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of what had been happening. The figure she had seen earlier, the shadow moving through, the trees, was it a person or something else entirely? She had no answers, only a gut feeling that told her they weren't alone, and that something out there was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The thought of leaving the cabin crossed her mind again, but the fog outside was a barrier, an impenetrable wall that would make any attempt to drive through it nearly impossible. The car was parked outside, but there was no way to know what dangers lay between the cabin and the road. Besides, with Sophie asleep and the fog surrounding them like a trap, any movement in the dark felt like a risk. They were stuck. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from somewhere outside. Jessica's heart leapt in her chest, and she instinctively moved towards Sophie, shaking her awake. Sophie's eyes fluttered open, disoriented at first, but then filled with fear when she saw the panic in her mother's face. "Mom, what's wrong?" Sophie asked, her small voice trembling. Jessica didn't answer right away. She stood, straining her ears to listen. The sound had come from outside the cabin, just beyond the fog. Another thud. Then a scraping noise, as if something was dragging across the ground. Her breath hitched in her throat. "Stay here, Sophie," Jessica whispered, trying to sound calm despite the rising terror inside her. She knew she had to investigate, had to see what was causing the noise, but she wasn't about to leave Sophie alone in the cabin. She quickly grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, her hands shaking as she flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness in front of her, but it barely reached more than a few feet beyond the door. Another thud, followed by a muffled scratching sound. Jessica's breath quickened and her mind raced. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going away. She glanced over her shoulder at Sophie, who was sitting on the couch, clutching a blanket tightly to her chest, eyes wide with fear. Jessica moved toward the door slowly, trying to keep her movements quiet, but the creaking of the floorboards felt like thunder in the stillness of the cabin. She reached for the door handle, then stopped, her hand frozen in mid-air. The sound had stopped. For a moment, the night seemed completely still. Then, without warning, the door to the cabin burst open with a violent force. Jessica stumbled back, in shock, the flashlight clattering to the floor as she grabbed onto the edge of the table for support. The door swung wildly in the wind, but no one was there. Just the thick fog pouring in through the open space, flooding the room with its cold, damp embrace. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. It was as if the fog had come alive, reaching into the cabin, pulling them into the darkness. She could feel it wrapping around her, the cold, suffocating air pressing against her skin. "Mom, please." Sophie's voice was barely a whisper, full of fear. Jessica turned to her daughter, trying to push down her own panic. She rushed over to Sophie, pulling her into her arms. "We need to get out of here now," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. Sophie's eyes widened, the realization dawning on her. "What's out there, Mum? What's happening?" "I don't know," Jessica replied, her voice tight with anxiety. "But we can't stay here. We need to go. Now." With her heart racing and adrenaline flooding her veins, Jessica grabbed Sophie's hand, pulling her toward the door. But just as they reached it, the fog outside seemed to shift. It thickened, rolling like waves, and from within it, a shape began to emerge. A figure, tall and indistinct, barely visible through the dense mist. It moved slowly, purposefully, toward the cabin. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. The figure was coming closer, its movements deliberate and unhurried. The fog clung to it like a shroud, and the closer it got, the more real it seemed. This wasn't a trick of the mind. It wasn't an illusion. There was something out there, and it was coming for them. Her mind raced, and in that moment, she knew they had no chance of escaping by car. The fog was too thick, the road too treacherous. There was no way out. As the figure drew nearer, Jessica had only one thought. They had to hide. They had to survive. The cabin was no longer safe, but it was the only place left to fight. She quickly pulled Sophie to the back of the cabin, hiding them both in the small room at the rear, locking the door behind them. But the sound of heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed from the front of the cabin, and as the fog crept closer, Jessica knew that no matter what happened next, the nightmare was far from over.